you say you spend more time looking into your past or ahead into the future? Welcome to the Parable Podcast. I'm your host, Danielle Zapchenk, and right now you're going to meet lead pastor of Forest City Church, Eric J. Parks, share about one of his hidden treasure epiphanies.
I often will say to people that breakdown is breakthrough. You'll see it oftentimes in our journeys that epiphanies don't normally come when everything is going just swimmingly. It's like when everything is perfect and you're just like, life is good. It seems like God uses breakdown to open my eyes to what could be.
Here's my conversation with Eric J. Parks. I have my friend Eric Parks here. Eric, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Eric, you are the lead pastor at Forest City Church, and I'd love for you to share a little bit about who you are, what you're all about.
Well, I am the lead pastor at Forest City Church. I think if I were trying to describe who am I at the deepest level, I am a futurist. I think a lot about where we're headed, not just as a people, but as the church. I've always been in that space thinking about, well, what's going to come next and where are we headed next? So I spend a lot of time in the future. It's said that people are divided into mostly two camps, those that the past is the most real and those that the future is the most real. And I certainly find myself in that second camp. Like I think about what could be, the possibilities. And so with that, I took the role of Forest City Church about 3 years ago, and it was all with the intended purpose of building a multi-ethnic church, a church that really is a reflection of the communities we live in. Because as I look to the future, one, it's a real reminder of actually our past. If you go all the way back to Acts chapter 2 and Acts chapter 13, and communities where everybody gets in and everybody gets a seat at the table. So that's what we've been trying to do the last 3 years, is build a community, a spiritual community like that.
Tell me more of like, who do you think helped shape that futuristic mindset for you? I mean, growing up, like there's so many people that press into our hearts and our mindset. So who was that for you?
You know, that's a good question. I'm not sure if I know or could pinpoint a specific person. I think I was always a dreamer as a kid. You know, make-believe was such a big part of my life. And yet it's really interesting because if you would have asked me at 13 or 14, are you an artist? Are you creative? I'd be like, no, I played baseball. I'm a baseball player. And yet, as I reflect back on who I really was, I mean, I was always in a space of like, what could be, and making things out of stuff and thinking about inventions and clever little ideas. I often tell people, I'm rarely, and I don't mean this in a self-deprecating way, I'm rarely the smartest person in any room, probably well below the mean, but I'm quite clever. And I think that word more accurately describes just a sense of creativity and possibility. I'm incredibly curious. Like I want to know about people. As soon as we sit down and someone at all will talk about travel, I'm like, okay, where have you gone? And where's your favorite place? And tell me why. In fact, one little secret about me for the world to know is that I have saved every restaurant I have ever been to in the world. I have it in my phone. And so you might say, hey, Eric, I'm going to Jerusalem. And it will be my first reaction to go, wait a minute, I know 4 restaurants there. So I am just a really curious, like adventurous. You see it even in the way that I travel and the way that I work and the spaces I take up. So I wouldn't say there was one person. I think over time, you become more of the person that you always were. Now, life has this interesting way in the early days of education systems of trying to shape us into things. But over time, I've just become more of that 10-year-old kid.
Well, that's a good perspective to have. And also, I do save like all of my restaurants as well. And also all of the restaurants I want to. Yeah. So the Google Maps, like it lets you put things in lists. So every vacation has a list. And so even when people, like I had friends that went to Nashville or the Destin area, I'm like, here, let me send you this link of every restaurant and why I love it.
You and I, we are going to be such good friends. It is a true statement that on a regular, I will get texts from people all over going, I'm going on a date night. I'm going into Chicago. Where should I go? And I'm like, we'll go to this place first and go to this place second. Oh, I get such joy out of that.
It is fun. I think that's the excitement. Like, that's why I love going out or going to places. It's like checking out. It's like you're uncovering a new adventure. So
it's an adventure.
Eric, we have 2 kids, a 10-year-old son and a 13-year-old daughter. And the other day we were at the pool, and I remember I was telling our son, I'm like, do you remember when we would like make believe that there was these trolls that were going to get us, and then we would go under the mushroom waterfall? Like, we had all these things. And he's just like, I kind of wish that, I could go back to being little, even though he's 10. And I'm just like, but you know what? We could still do that. Like, there's no rules saying that we can't still make believe. So I'd love for you to speak into like, why is it that some of us, like that future mindset or just wanting that creativity or make believe, like that gets kind of stunted in our lives?
Well, here's what I believe to be true. And I think it starts this way. Every single one of us are, when it comes to like traumas that we experience and the road that we walk down, we all have traumas that have come in our life. And they might have come when we were 10 or 12 or whatever, but we have these traumas that are put on us, right? And most of the way that our minds work is our minds want to take really complex situations and bake them into simpler ways of thinking. And there's a whole book I just finished reading on the way that our minds work, that we move from complex ideas to simple. We want to simplify everything. And especially when it comes to the traumas in life that we experience, the hardships, oftentimes what happens is we take those really hurtful, those experiences that have shaped us negatively, and we try to bake it down into something we can understand in order for us to survive. And so we will oftentimes create survival mechanisms that allow us to navigate the rest of our lives in a very predictable way. And they work. They keep us alive. They keep us from hurting. The problem is the very mechanisms we create for simplicity and survival become the actual things that create pain and lock us into a box. It's this strange thing, and one of the great journeys we all have to go on in order to come back to whatever that is. The original question was creativity, but anytime you're coming back to yourself, whether you're creative or you're an architect or whomever that little inner child is you're coming back to, will take the deconstruction of all the techniques that you've learned in your life in order to survive. And that's hard. In fact, oftentimes you'll see when we go on the process of journeying back to who we are, who we're meant to be, your body will tell you, you will struggle with anxiety and deep like depression in the process of breaking old patterns, because your mind believes that by breaking this pattern, you're threatening its survival. It's because this pattern has been built up. And so oftentimes we hear traumas, we think about those in very specific ways, but traumas can be small, they can be big. The reality is we just create systems to survive, and oftentimes those systems of survival actually become traps and keep us stuck. And it's really the journey we have to go on. Every single person, you'll face a time in your life when you'll have to decide, will I go back to that kid? Like, when your child said, I like to be a kid again. Every one of us will have those moments where like, I want to go back to that person, to who that person is, because it's the purest, most perfect sense of how God made me. So
that's a good answer. I like that. Eric, you said 3 years ago, you just, came on staff and started leading as a pastor at Forest City Church. And it was at a hard place at that point. And you told me a couple months ago that people were like, why are you doing this? You should not be taking this role. Talk to me a little bit about what was going through your mind when you feel like, hey, like this is something I want to do, but like people are telling me like, I don't think so.
It was April of 2020. So pandemic starts. And honestly, I've been doing church work for a really long time. And the only context I've ever actually known is not just church work, but white mega church work. I say white because it'll make sense in the whole story. I've only predominantly functioned in these cultures that are predominantly male, predominantly white, and that's what I've known. Yeah. I decided November of 2019 that, and again, this is the curiosity and creative side, that I was going to take a role in software. I got offered a job as head of products for a software company. Like, that sounds like fun. I know nothing about software, so sure. And it was during the pandemic and a random interaction with a close friend that I wondered if maybe I shouldn't give this one more try. The church that had called was a predominantly white megachurch outside Chicago, and they were in a tough way. Pandemic hits. They asked if I would talk to them. I said yes. And one of the things I recognized as a futurist, as well as someone who's really spent a lot of time thinking about like what are the communities we want to build, is it seems to me that the power of the gospel is the way it unites all people, or has the power to. And when we're talking about pandemic 2020, that's also about the same time George Floyd happens, Ahmaud Arbery happens. There are protests bubbling up all over the country. This is like a flashpoint. And I thought, if the gospel doesn't have an answer for this, which I know it does, why aren't we building communities that would address this? I remember flying in and saying, listen, I'll help you, but I gotta tell you that I believe the most powerful apologetic is the reality that the cross in Ephesians 2 says it unites all people, right? Like it pulls us together. Imagine a place where you walked by and you went, how in the world do all those people like hang out together? That doesn't even make any sense. And it speaks to the veracity of the gospel. And so I was very, very naive about this, because I was like, here's a church that is in a tough spot. And they said yes. And so we're going to do it. We're going to build a multi-ethnic church. Little did I know what that meant or the journey I would go on. But most of my friends were saying, don't do this, not because of the ambition, but most of the signs that you would look for in terms of health and a place that could sustain this sort of vision weren't apparent. And so my friends were like, hey, I think you're going someplace that's going to be impossible. So that was the general sense of my friends. And they were probably right in some ways.
Yeah, but I mean, look, I know it's only 3 years in, and obviously, I appreciate your vulnerability and saying like, you know what, maybe I was naive and going in, and how much it takes to build a church. I mean, it takes a lot, and you bring in other people and other ideas, and there's so much to it. What has been one of the joys that has come out of the last 3 years that you're just like, I could have never imagined this?
I would say there's probably two that have been profoundly impacting and bring a true sense of like, this is worth doing it. One has been watching inside of our space what it looks like when men and women of color are given the opportunity to step in and be exactly who they are. I mean, it's a little bit of what I was talking about at the beginning. This is why I'm so passionate about this journey back to ourselves, because that journey back, that is not for just white men. It is for all of us. And the journey back to ourselves includes, all of how we were made. Yeah. So watching young African-American men and women step into calling and feel released to be them. Like one of the things we met early on, and I said, here's the deal. I don't want you to assimilate to the culture. In fact, part of the reason why we changed the name of, it used to be called Heartland Community Church to Forest City Churches. I thought it was really important that a new identity was set that said something brand new. Yeah. And Rockford is known as the Forest City, so it seemed like an appropriate name. But to watch freedom, like someone step into that and feel like, oh, I get to show up the way I show up. Yeah. To watch Carrington Gaines, our worship leader, like show up, full version of himself. Every Sunday that I get to watch him lead worship, or Lauren or Andy, who leads at our Elgin campus, there's a sense of, well, this should be for everyone. that we get to show up and be who we were made to be. And that leads to the second piece. We're watching a community, and we have a campus in Elgin as well. We're watching these two communities now begin to reflect our community. And it used to be that, churches like ours, I've heard the phrase, well, your church is like a country club. And I think if you're an out group, it feels like that, right? Like, I wouldn't know what to do if I showed up in your church. It's too nice and it's too pretty. And what we've watched happen is not only our congregations become more reflective of the communities that we live in, like for real, but also more reflective, not just in race, but of socioeconomic status of people who are struggling with addiction, real people like you and me showing up and going, oh, there is a different way. Yeah. And to me, I'm like, oh, that's the church. That's what we're supposed to be about. And so every Sunday I get to walk into the lobbies of both these churches and look around and go, where are you people coming from? Yeah. And isn't it awesome? Isn't it awesome?
I mean, God can just do so much, and just to see how he brings different people into our life. And again, it doesn't even become about us anymore, because these communities are building upon themselves. And it's crazy what God can continue to do. And it's just getting started. And I mean, there's a couple of the folks from your church, Andy and Leonard and Michael, that are on previous episodes. If you want to hear their stories as well, I'll put those in the show notes. But I think that's the beauty of community and church, is that we have these stories. And gosh, when we get a chance to unlock it and see our true, genuine self, and also in others, gosh, it's so beautiful. It is so beautiful. Yeah. You had talked earlier about like how we have to change our complex thoughts into simple. And I think that's what Jesus does really with these parables, is that there's these complex thoughts about what is the kingdom of God, and he just brings it down to the most simplest form to help us understand. And I think the same goes for our lives. And we look at our life, you're like, gosh, this is so complex. This is hard. But later on, when we get that perspective, you're like, wow, I saw what you did there. So Eric, I'd love for you to share just one of your parable stories with us today.
Well, there's a parable, and it's really, really short. There's so many. I'm a storyteller by nature. So like the idea of parable and story is one of my favorite things. I love that Jesus would often in scripture, I had a professor once say, he would walk you off to the edge of a cliff, and he'd tell you this story. And about the time that you start to ask questions, you look around and he'd be gone, right? He just would leave you with this. And that's the beauty of a story, right? Like I can find myself in it. I can find so much meaning in it. And there's so many that are packed full, but this specific parable is just really timely, and it's so small and so short, and it doesn't get talked about a ton, but if it's okay, I'll just read it real quick. Go ahead. This is found in Matthew 13, and it's the parable of the hidden treasure. It's verse 44. It says, the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure that a man discovered hidden in a field. In his excitement, he hid it again. He sold everything he owned and got enough money to buy the field and get the treasure too. And the reason why I love this is it describes Epiphany, and all of life is really guided through these moments where all of a sudden something I did not realize before, I now realize. I often will say to people that breakdown is breakthrough. You'll see it oftentimes in our journeys, that epiphanies don't normally come when everything is going just swimmingly, right? It's like when everything is perfect and the dog isn't sick and the kids are doing great and there's enough money in the bank account and you're not fighting with your husband or your wife and you're just like, life is good. It seems like God uses breakdown to open my eyes to what could be, like seasons that almost seem unbearable, that God uses for me to see what actually matters. And those moments are really encouraging for me, because I think we structure our lives in such a way that we try to avoid breakdown. It's breakdown avoidance, fire avoidance. Like, how can I build enough systems and enough comfort and enough that I never have to face that, when in actuality, the best thing that can happen is an epiphany, where all of a sudden you see, and I think the parable is so beautiful because this is talking about the kingdom of heaven works. Well, that's massive. all of a sudden, this guy one day, and why was it that day? I don't know. He had a bad day. His dog died. I would guess that if he's human, something got his attention and it created a breakthrough. And it was, we've had these moments, I'm sure every single one of us, where you have a realization like, oh my gosh, the path I'm on. Oh my gosh, where am I headed? Oh my gosh, my patterns of thinking. Oh my gosh. And when we get to those moments and you realize it, he sells everything. Yeah. It's just a metaphor. Like, I'm all in. Like, I got to get back to that person. And it's why, I thought about how we let out around this journey back to who we were made to be. This is the great journey, right? Yeah. This journey to become that person that God thought up when he thought you up, which I will tell people, I'm like, you realize the God of the universe, he thought you up. Like, he was like, here's how Eric will be made and constructed. And so the journey back to how he made us, what a beautiful God ordained journey, back to like original intent, back to the way we were designed to function. And all of the things that flow out of that, health and wholeness, and the way that we're able now to unwind our neuroplasticity and begin to create new patterns. It is this journey back, but it always starts, with an epiphany. Yeah. Where you go, oh my gosh, I cannot live this way anymore. I cannot. And when you get there, you'll do like a farmer, whatever it takes. Yeah.
Eric, I'd love to know for you, like, what was one of your epiphanies in your life? Because, we have so many, but what's one that stands out?
Well, I think recently, honestly, it has come through pain. I look at the last 3 years and the journey that I've been on. And one of the things I stopped doing is comparing my pain to anyone else's. Because that's a fool's errand, right? Like, your pain is real to you and it is painful to you. And it really doesn't do any good to say if mine is worse, or oftentimes we'll downplay it and go, well, mine's not as bad as. Yeah. I just own the fact that I've had some things happen in my life that have caused pain. I've created patterns that have robbed me from relationships and robbed me from the truest sense of who God made me to be. And oftentimes our jobs do it, our roles do it. We become and we adopt, again, like I said, these patterns. I think the biggest epiphany for me was that the thing that matters most is not what's going on around me, but what's going on inside of me. We usually, as humans, believe that if I can control the circumstances around me, if I can build enough wealth, if I can put enough stuff into my space, if I have the right titles, I can get my internal world put right. And it's really, we believe it. And we even believe it in our churches. We do. We are like, if we do these right things externally, and then we have a constant gnawing because it's like, well, I did all these things and I still don't feel put right inside. Like, I have this constant sense that something isn't right. And my epiphany is that external circumstances will not put right your internal world. The only way to get your internal world put right is to go internal and to begin to do the work internal. And as I have begun to reframe my mind, the way that I think, the patterns that I have adopted over the years for survival, and I begin to undo those, what's becoming pretty real to me is epiphany. You can live through a lot of external circumstances that aren't that great when your internal world is at peace. You can learn literally how to watch feelings and emotions and situations like they're clouds or water just roll right past you. And here's what's beautiful about my faith. Oftentimes when we think of going internal, we think, oh, well, that's language for therapy, or that's an Eastern idea. But it's really at the core of our faith, because think about it. God's Spirit, we don't invite him. Like, oftentimes I'll hear songs that we sing like, Spirit, you're welcome here. And I'm like, well, I hope so, because he lives inside you. Our faith is one where when we walk and accept Jesus, it says that he goes and takes up residence. So every time we go internal, it's actually how we go face to face with God. The internal journey puts us face to face with God. We begin to see him more clearly. And it does sound, if you're listening to podcasts, it's almost like, oh, well, that, right, Pollyanna. Put your internal world right and none of the stuff around you will matter. I'm not saying it won't matter. I'm just saying that if peace is what you're looking for, a sense of consistent joy, the things that flow around us will always keep you feeling like you're on sand. When we begin to move internal and reshape our mind, this is why the Apostle Paul says, think on these things, like think on this stuff, like do this stuff. It will change everything. And it has, for me, I'm in the last probably year, changed everything.
That's great, Eric. I'd like to circle back to when you were talking about comparing our pain. A couple years ago, a friend mentioned that to me because it is when you hear somebody who has had a huge traumatic struggle, I just look at my life and I'm like, well, I guess I just don't have it that bad, or like, it's mine. Like, what's the point of like praying when obviously that person needs much more prayer than I do? Talk to me a little bit about like figuring that out for ourselves, of getting to a mindset of each of our pain is equal in God's sight.
Well, there's a saying that you cannot heal it if you do not feel it. And what we're doing when we step into these cycles of minimizing our pain is actually creating false narratives about what hurt us. And we're denying ourselves the ability to actually feel what hurt us, right? We're convincing ourselves that, well, that didn't hurt. It would be like you smash your thumb with a ball peen hammer and you go to the hospital and your thumb is pretty devastated, but you see somebody who just got in a motorcycle wreck and deciding like, well, gosh, I guess this isn't that big a deal because he got in a motorcycle wreck. Yeah. I'll just go home. Mm-hmm. Well, you would be like, well, wait a minute, your finger is destroyed. What good does it do in the healing process for you to assume that your destroyed finger is somehow any less painful or any less important for healing than someone whose leg or whole body got destroyed, right? Mm-hmm. So absolutely. It's the same thing. It's the same thing. It's saying, hey, you cannot heal it unless you feel it. And the feeling it, stepping into it, acknowledging it, saying, no, this was real pain. And someone else's pain doesn't really matter in your healing journey. It's like, and it will be different for the thumb than it will be for the motorcycle accident. The process will look different, but still the end result is, I want my thumb not to hurt anymore. And so I think that's the metaphor I often think about is like, hurt is real. I say this to people all the time too. I'm like, oftentimes when we think about being hurt, we don't like the idea that we're a victim, and we also don't like the idea that we're a perpetrator. And yet every single person is both. Yeah,
that's so good.
We hurt people and we get hurt. And, again, I love this process of, again, the parable is such a great parable for me of like understanding, like these moments where you wake up to, oh, that's what life should look like. And I had a friend, this is kind of gross, but I'm going to tell a story. You can edit it out. He has this, and you know this friend, but I'm not going to say his name because he would kill me. He played basketball in college, and he for 20 years has had a toe problem. It's like this ingrown because of basketball and the shoes and the things.
Yeah.
Right? For 20 years, he has refused to go to the doctor, and he can't bend his toe. I mean, I was out, we were playing soccer in a field and he's limping around. This is like 6 months ago. I'm like, what are you doing? He's like, this is crazy toe. I'm like, why don't you go to the doctor?
Yeah.
It's not that big a deal. It's fine. And then this just happened this week. He finally had enough. And he went to the doctor and they did it was a surgery, but it was an inpatient surgery. And he's like, bro, I can move my toe. He goes, why didn't I do this 20 years ago?
Yeah.
And I'm like, exactly.
Gosh, I had another pastor on who had a tooth issue. He was my promotions assistant when I was in radio. And he said he had it like back then and it was for years and it was just horrendous. And it's like those little things where like, oh, it's going to get better. Like it's no big deal. And it's just something so simple. Eric, I recently, there's 2 documentaries that have been out, about large megachurches, just people who have really been truly spiritually abusive to their congregation. And I didn't watch it because I'm like, ooh, let me find out the gory details. But I watched it from a perspective of, as somebody who's in leadership and from ministry, how can we not do that? How can we continue to build guardrails? How do we have accountability? And also at the end of one of them, I mean, my heart just broke because there was 4 or 5 multiple people, I'm sure, like thousands, who have left the church because they didn't see Jesus. They just saw this person that was just spiritually abusive and power hungry. You know, when you said you left the mega white church mentality, how do we, like, as the body, how do we just make sure that we are just like Jesus to people and we are asking people to come to the table and be a part of it? Like, everybody is welcome. It's so important. So how do we do that in our daily lives of just continuing to welcome people to the table?
Well, each leader has to make decisions, and just like each person. It does come down to pursuit, doesn't it? What is it that you're really trying to do? Now, this isn't just true of megachurches, because if we go back over the last 5 years and we see the abuses that have taken place in corporations, the Me Too movement, we have seen absolute grotesque abuse of power in many spaces. And the church is the last place you want to see that, for sure. But it comes down to, how do we begin as leaders to take internal issues more seriously? Again, we often build all of our self-worth on these external forces that will justify small little pieces of bad behavior in order to promote and to protect the whole. But what we're often doing isn't really protecting the whole. We've tied so much personal value. I think most of these issues all come down to a misinvested, misplaced heart.
Yeah.
Like, it's all of this healing stuff that you have assumed that if I build these kingdoms, whether they're church kingdoms or corporate kingdoms, that somehow it will sustain me. And it doesn't work, but we can't undo it. And we don't undo it because there's an immense amount of fear. And so we keep these systems alive because, again, these systems say survival, right? And so our church is, sadly, is the last place we want to see that, because you expect that church leaders are stepping into mental health and stepping into spiritual health and going inward and finding God's Spirit. Because when you're in there, if you're really doing that work, it's much more difficult to abuse people. When you're really doing the work internal, it's why one of the phrases, we have like these 5 directions that we talk about at our church. And we say, you know, we want to be a people who go backward. We want to know where we came from. And we want to be a people that go forward and we go together. We want to be a people that go upward in Christ. But there's one that, like, oftentimes is left out. We want a people that go inward and we do our work, because when you do your work, you actually protect the flock, the people. And it is a refusal to do the work, to be vulnerable. I love Brene Brown's quote. She says that we want to have a really soft front, but a really stiff spine. We oftentimes have a very hard front and a very soft spine. That vulnerability, that comes as a byproduct of internal work, emotional work, like spirit work, where we are just continuously looking at our heart and continuously going internal and continuously shining a light on the dark places in our lives and being open and being honest and saying sorry. Look, if you're a human, if you're a leader, you're going to mess some stuff up. You just will, because it's unavoidable. And I found that in relationships, the relationships that thrive, whether they be corporate relationships or relationships with our spouses, they actually strengthen. The bonds of connection strengthen when, through turmoil, we come back together and we genuinely say, I'm really sorry for what I did, and I'm sorry for how I approached it. But it is internal. We got to have more church leaders do their work and be in therapy and be in God's word and all of the things that are work in order to be whole. Whole people create whole systems. Broken people will create broken systems.
Absolutely.
So,
well, thank you for that reminder, Eric. It is really doing the work and kind of like going back to like the hidden treasure. Like there is so much treasure within us that God wants to allow us to unlock. And it's up to us. Like we have to put in the work. I appreciate.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, I appreciate this conversation so much. Thank you for helping us have that futuristic mindset as well. Just being open to that. And again, that's why I love these conversations, because it allows me to be like, oh yeah, I've never thought of it from that perspective. So thank you so much, Eric. Eric, if they wanted to get connected with you, how can they do that?
You can send a letter. Just kidding. Just old-fashioned.
My fax number is...
I think it'd be awesome to have a fax and just have people fax you things. That sounds like a real Bob Goff thing to do, doesn't it?
I love him.
I do too. Well, my Instagram is at Eric J. Parks. It's the easiest way to get a hold of me and connect with me.
All right. Well, Eric, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
I really enjoy conversations like the one I had with Eric today, that it allows me to have these fresh perspectives that I've never even thought about before. That's the beauty of sharing stories. To connect with Eric, simply visit daniellezapchenk.com for details. And here are 2 reflection questions from our time with Eric today. Number 1, what is something that you've been working through lately? Maybe it is positive or maybe it's really challenging. Just take a moment to think about it with a futuristic mindset. Number 2, spend some time in prayer today to ask the Holy Spirit to uncover what hidden treasure He wants to reveal to you today. One easy way you can support the Parable Podcast is simply by sharing it with a friend. If you could pass that along today, that really helps people find out about these amazing parable stories. And thank you to my technical producer, also named Eric, for his top-notch editing skills. That is going to do it for today. I'm grateful that you took the time to spend it with me. Remember, your parable showcases how God has given you so much hidden treasure. We'll see you back again next week on the Parable Podcast.